Well, thank you very much, Dean Rowe, for these very kind words. I do feel a genuine pleasure in coming back here, not only because I think Harvard Yard and everything physical about it is just plain beautiful, especially at this time of the year, but to me it has always had a connotation of having had the most profoundest impact on my architectural education and everything that's happened to me since, and what's guided me throughout many years of architectural activity. As has been said, the late 1940s were a unique period, I think, in the development of architecture. It was the after the war period where there was general optimism. The horror of the war was behind everyone, and people came back from the armed forces, and they wanted to make a better physical world, a better world altogether. And there was much optimism and looking into the future. And this was compounded by the coincidence of having these remarkable people who had come from Europe to teach architecture here. Could we have the pictures maybe and the lights out? This is the class of 1946, so what went on, 45, 46, what went on generally with Gropius, in whose class I was, together with some of the people that have been mentioned. Gropius went from desk to desk, giving individual criticism to 16 students that were in his year. At the same time, people also gravitated to other desks where Breuer was giving criticism in his other years, bachelor's degree or lower degrees. I think what made the school amazing is two things. First of all, the individuals that Gropius brought with him, as well as, of course, his remarkable gifts as a pedagogue. He brought with him Breuer soon after he came in the late 30s. He brought Martin Wagner, who was in charge of the town plan of Berlin, who he brought here to do planning. He invited Gideon, who wrote this book, which then was a fairly new, as it were, almost the Bible, Space-Time and Architecture, from Switzerland. He had consultants locally who gave advice on structures such as Weidling. It was an electrifying atmosphere, mainly because it was the time of all the horror of the war was finished and everyone was pushing forward to make a good new world. Now, what he did really in the way of criticism to students was, this picture is characteristic of it. He sat at a person's desk, never taking a pencil in his hand to show you what was wrong. He, after his lectures, where he expounded his fundamental theory about very simply common sense way of finding a simultaneous solution to problems of use, of being at the cutting edge of structural or technological thinking, but above all, and this seems to be that which has got lost so much in modern architecture, it had to have its relation to the art of the time, the art forms of the time, and to visual phenomena, and that was the most argued about thing. So here he was sitting and arguing with the person, not helping him do it better, but just asking me questions. How do you get yourself to do that? And is that the way? And what is your really aesthetic aim in this thing? Explain it to me. And everybody, of course, gathered around and listened to this. And they went from desk to desk, and the whole year did that. And it was a wonderful experience that I can vouch for. As I say, the visual aspect was argued about most, because most Americans, and the student body was made up from all over the world. There were people from South America mainly, some from Europe, England, and so on. And their cultural background wasn't such that they could immediately relate to what the man was talking about in his lectures about visual phenomena and fundamentals of vision and how your eye responds predictably to certain visual phenomena. That was alien to them, really, as it was to me. And everybody said, no, why? Why is this better than that? Why shouldn't I be able to do that? And finally he said, well, if you really want to learn more about this, you should go to Black Mountain College. Black Mountain was in South Carolina, and I certainly went there because that was the one missing link. Everybody could make common sense of practical criticisms or questions or technical ones, but why do you make things look this way rather than that? And this was an experience, bar none, for me to be confronted with Joseph Albers, who's also a remarkable teacher, that had nothing to do with architecture, but he just taught people how to understand how their eyes responded to certain visual impacts. And one learned fundamentally that, which meant that there is a certain common denominator, what our eye makes us, what our age makes our eyes see, which changes with time. And I will try and point that out in the buildings, because art and technology, as was Gropius's theme all through, move hand in hand. They move together. And when technology has new tools and new potential, that must change the visual result. All of us had not seen any modern architecture at that time. There was none in this country. Everybody had seen the books. I'm delighted to see this marvelous show of the Weissenhofsiedlung outside, which was one of the images that certainly was known to us, as were all the books of Corbusier and all the buildings that Gropius had built, and nobody in America had done anything like that. And that gave that much more substance to what the man was saying, aside from the compelling way in which he did. But everybody flocked to the houses that he and Breuer built. This is Gropius's own house, I'm sure you know it, built in about 1937 out here in Lincoln, together with a whole score of other houses that the partnership of Gropius and him produced, which were really at the very forefront of everyone's mind. Now, after this, as the Dean has mentioned, I had something of an odyssey that took a number of years after working with Breuer, because I was determined to keep on learning more from this group of people who I think had a powerful message. So I worked with Breuer for a couple of years and learned, from the ground up, as it were, how to make buildings, and they had to be pretty simple buildings. And finally, I was invited by my parents to come to Australia for a visit to build my parents a house. And when you're 25 years old and you're asked by a mother to build her a house, boy, I mean, how could you resist that? I mean, it's a captive client, bar none. So I proceeded to go and do that, of course. And I'll just quickly go through now some of the kind of things that I built. On the left one is the house for my parents, built in 1948. My parents are long dead, and the house now is owned by the state. It's a museum. This was built nearby, a house that was really a holiday house for someone, a weekend house. And this is characteristic of the thinking in structural terms. The less you do, the better. The minimum with a maximum result, the minimum effort and material to do a maximum result. So this house stands on 4 legs. They put up the frame very quickly, and you fill it in, and you get what is essentially really an Australian phenomenon. It's a warm climate. It's a country that Sydney is 34 degrees from the equator, which is on the latitude of the southern Mediterranean. So one does tend to build glass walls with protecting shadows. Visually, I think one of the lessons was, if you start a certain theme, such as this structural notion of diagonal hangers, which make obvious common sense, then you don't leave it at that and start something different around the corner. You repeat it, and the stairs of a comparable slope. In other words, there's a kind of a repeat, an echo of geometries and forms that you concern yourself. Well, this house is some 20 years later. It's my own house, but maybe something's happened since then in that I found that solid building materials are inevitably longer lasting. I think we don't have the timbers that the United States has, and concrete is a substance that, of course, if used wisely, is a magnificent material to build from. I still live in this house. It's totally unchanged. And what this does, again, is to come to terms with the fact that concrete's problem, if there is one, it's the cost of formwork. To make flat forms is easier than making beams that hang down. So here the beams go up, which is very logical for cantilevers because that's in tension. You've got steel bars in the top, and this slab, which is poured first, is fully in compression, and that's what concrete's good at doing. So by doing that, I think you minimize the impact of what people normally think is an expensive thing to do, but that need not be so. Inside, you get the great advantage, of course, with having these muscly supports and things that can hang out and expand beyond their points of support by giving you planes that virtually float in space. You get vertical and horizontal planes intersecting, and the greatest medium of all, the space is created. And it's reminiscent and harks back to what Gropius said, that it should relate to the painting of the time. Although this painting was done a lot earlier, there's some obvious similarities in the way planes generate space and interact. Now let's take a jump in just while we're on houses, and I will almost go through houses, which I still love doing. What's happened 20 years further on again. In the 80s, there were things happening in the paintings that removed or substituted much greater flamboyance in much of the painter's work that are celebrated. A greater richness appeared compared to the 40s, 50s, and I think that's had an influence. Not a conscious one, but in retrospect, that suddenly you're not satisfied with just building rectilinear intersecting planes and building forms, but at the same time, technology has given architects a new tool, and that is the pre-stressing wires. It's just amazing what you can do in reinforced concrete when you pre-stress it. And that gives new freedom to the shaping of projecting elements of this kind. That would have been pretty difficult to do. Nothing's impossible, of course, but it's more foolproof when you start compressing the concrete, which it's good at resisting, and you do get a greater freedom of choice in what you do. And this is, by the way, is fairly typical of the sort of suburbs around Sydney, which is a city with a wonderful harbour, with a lot of inlets, and many people live along the harbour. This interior even has an elevator. And the terraces are shaped for logical reasons that it's not there, but people wanted to be able to put a table and chairs, which normal balconies that are very narrow don't usually do very well. So you widen it in one part and narrow it in another, and you get the kind of form that appears more appropriate. And this, crescendo of curvilinear intersections has gone on, and this goes now into the 1990s. Both inside and outside the house, there's far greater richness made possible by using, as I say, pre-stressed concrete. Now, technology also, and I will so far talk only houses. This is now the 90s. because industry can now give us, at the drop of a hat almost, curved, big steel beams. You can ask the factory to do this to a steel beam, which would have been possible, but not very easily possible in the past. And suddenly, these things have become quite readily available. And I think they give opportunities for enlarging volumes and giving emphasis to some parts which would have been almost unthinkable before. The forms of houses, as a consequence, can also become much freer in choice of curvilinearity and hollowing of the form, you know, penetrating vertically. These are reinforced concrete floors, but also pre-stressing is used so as to just obviate any of the inevitable old problems that concrete used to have. And as I mentioned, the climate, we do have a problem with sun. So if you use very big areas of glass, it's responsible, that's to say the least, to protect from the sun. So that's about up to date as far as houses, and I've always liked building houses, but this sort of shows the progression following the fundamental criteria of what really was taught here. Now, at the same time, housing was much discussed, and I will show something of that here, but it relates also to the 19th century building form in Australia, which is quite distinctive, what we call terrace houses. Very logical row housing dating from the middle of the, early to middle of the 19th century. People built very sensible cross-walled housing, and much of that is, of course, quite valid in this day and age. In the old days, they used to bring cast iron in the bottom of sailing ships as ballast from England, and there is an awareness, obviously, in the kind of terraces these were, that they are in a warm climate. They don't look like the ones in Manchester or anywhere else in England where they're flat and you know, where there isn't the sun. But these were quite sensitively related and expressed a kind of architecture that I think gave a new, almost climatic and geographic expression to English Georgian architecture. Now that should find its counterpoint in what today is done. And there's a village of houses that is done on that principle of joined houses, which are obviously more economic to do rather than freestanding houses. And that's a theme that's, of course, ages old. This is a picture of a hillside town in Spain. The wonderful thing is about these, and this is old, going back to the Middle Ages, some of it, but also brand new. There are new ones, new infills here and there, next to quite old ones. But they only use two materials, and that's these Roman tiles and whitewashed masonry. And here's the counterpart today using exactly that sort of thing. It's not quite as dense and not quite as pushed together, but what is aimed for here is that everybody has a view of the lake that's at the bottom of this valley and maximizing the outlook. When the community of those houses has a focus, it is inserted, this is a sort of recreational village, the swimming pool, the community thing. The forms that are used in contradiction to the houses, which inevitably followed very economic, minimal sort of lines, is also somehow related, if one looks at it afterwards, to work such as that by Arp. In other words, it's a counterpoint to the rectilinearity of the rest. Row housing, I think, is something not only logical, economic, but it is distinctly Australian, where this was a form of urban housing that I think has a language appropriate for today. Here is a group of houses on a site where all of them look our sun is on the north. It's the equivalent of the south here, toward the sun. And that doesn't mean that those houses need be minimal or, you know, have anything to do with the traditional form. It's possible to make houses that have a spatial freedom and openness inside quite economically, relating different levels in the house together and giving excitement to something that's really a very economical habitat. I think what is important is to say something about this kind of housing and planning, which has very much its roots right in this school, well, not exactly this building, but in Robinson Hall. That's where the action was, very nearby here. Through the teaching of Martin Wagner. Little is known about this man. He was quite a simple fellow, but not by his works. If you look in the books of what he built in Berlin and Frankfurt and other cities of Europe, you will understand. Now, this pattern that we developed for Australia was really something emanated from his notions, which is that if the Anglo-Saxon world wants to live in individual houses, it is best to arrange those along cul-de-sac streets so as to not have children having to cross streets and hazards of traffic, which is delegated to go around such a suburb or neighborhood unit, as we used to call them here. And that should include some of this kind of medium density housing and the little shopping center and the primary school, kindergarten and so on at its core. So every housewife can take a child in the pram and go shopping without crossing any streets, and children can go to school the same way. Now this emanated right here. Now there's very little of that being done, if any, in the world that seems to be dedicated to the quarter-acre block of land, and everybody lives in the suburbs. So, but a mix of densities, such as introducing a mixture of low density, 12 people an acre, 35, and high-rise buildings where housing, such as here, can reach 150 people an acre if necessary. Now let us switch tack and let's talk about the city, where a sphere in which I've been largely involved ever since the 1960s. These images of Western cities, I think they're summed up by a sketch of Niemeyer's, who simply says no to this. 6th Avenue in New York finds its parallel in Sydney and every other city in the world. And there are two aspects of it. People talk about the concrete jungle and how unattractive it is, noisy. You know, we don't any more of it. And although politicians haven't the clout to change the index, I understand, or plot ratio, whatever you want to call it, in New York it's something up to 30, I understand, 30 times the site area in floor space. In Australia it's only up to 14, which is enough. They say, well, you can build that much, but we want street architecture, and that is really something that just doesn't work together. They want to push the buildings down and have sort of have them spread right over the site, and towers come out of the middle of the site, which is horrendous architecturally and from a practical point of view. Now there is one reality that's with us, and that is something in man will always want to express ambition. Why on earth did people in Bologna and San Gimignano build these inexplicable towers? One family wanted as soon as one finished a tower, the next family built one taller. They're almost unusable. Still a mystery what they were for, but they're still there, incredibly high, made out of just plain brickwork. And there's nothing different today, because in my experience, big corporations, they want to have their image in a tall building, and don't tell them to have one that's only 5 or 6 stories high. They want a tower. Building authorities, politicians tend to be disenchanted with that, make great problems. It's casting shadows, it's going to cause wind and so on. But I think that will not be removed. People still want that. But my view is this of the city, that there's something in cities that is missing at the moment, and that is elbow room at ground level. I think that what is so disliked in Western cities and what is so loved in European old cities is the magnificent open spaces that exist. That's why, you know, all the tourists flock to Siena on the right, or Rothenburg in Germany, wherever, and there's countless places that have pedestrian areas, no cars, but restaurants, great events, sometimes civic events taking place, and there is just simply no valid or reasonable counterpart to that. Now, when commissioned to do a tall building to an index of 12 at that time, meaning 12 times the site area, I pushed developer clients into doing just 2 buildings on that site and argued for greater height. So a 50-story building, this is the site. There were 30 different properties. Today they would all be declared national monuments because they're old. Anything old nowadays is sacrosanct, it seems. But in those days, there was nothing of great value there at all. So they pushed all this down, and we built just 2 buildings. And why I say the advantage that came with it is the elbow room and the place of repose that comes with it. And I have formulas for how to make this attractive to people. When you just enlarge a footpath, you get nowhere. Nobody will linger there. Nobody will want to sit there any length of time right next to cars or where the wind just blows. It has to be removed from traffic, preferably by the help of screen walls and vertically, some steps up or a bit of ramp up. You know, cars don't want to be an integral part of such spaces. Food has to be accessible, and tables and chairs and umbrellas, and you've got it going, because then when you add water and trees, then people will want to sit and linger and like it. And that's a formula that I think I've found works extremely well. Let's just look at this round tower that was the result, and this goes back to 1963. Sydney looks very different since then. But it was my fortune through Breuer's office when he was building the UNESCO building in Paris. I met Pierluigi Nervi, who I invited to be a consultant on this building. And this is, he not only taught us how to build a building, but also solved some heavily loaded exhibition floors for us, which are visible in the lobby from underneath by the use of his ferro cement pans. There are 7 different of these very thin concrete shell elements made. They're put on minimal formwork, and the space between them creates these interlocking ribs, which are very rigid, of course, and there's a kind of expression of statics here that is particularly beautiful. In other words, it's not something that just happens to be, but it reflects the isostatic nature of what actually takes place in that building. He taught us to build buildings without external scaffolding. These forms, as you saw in the previous picture, are made out of white quartz, cement permanent formwork, concrete formwork with white quartz, so that it remains white virtually indefinitely. And these forms in 2 halves are put up as columns, and they change shape. Logically, they're bigger at the bottom than they need to be at the top. And I think that helps a great deal to give the building its soaring sort of appearance. Here's one. The main point about this is, of course, that such buildings only use the maximum allowable in the city, such as an index of 12 or 14 in our case, and then the rest of the site is left open or left to being used by the public as newly gained public space on private land. It turns out not only be an asset to the city, but I think it's also good for business. People like it, and the spaces in these buildings tend to be more readily taken up by tenants than they are in a building that just glued itself to the footpath and gives nothing to the city. Nervi taught us here again to change this building of some 1,500 square meters. I don't know what that's in feet. But it's quite a large floor area, and all these floors are column-free. But he taught us to give greater rigidity to tall buildings made of concrete by turning its feet outward almost. You know, you get if you spread your feet out, you're more stable from being pushed over them when they are together. And these forms at the base of the tower, and this is a rigid form of ribs that tie them to the wind-resisting core. And that changes as the building rises. They become, in fact, flush with the top. As you can see here, this is a twisted outward form. And each floor, and it's all precast in the factory, is only minimally different. You can have formwork that produces these elements in effect, and they become flush with the top of the building. The formula has become traditionally that, in our experience, that you have to be able to build a floor, including its structure, every 4 or 5 working days. If a building is designed to take longer than that, it becomes uneconomic, because the hundreds of millions that these things cost in terms of interest rates simply eliminate them from reality. Here's a problem, and this dates back to the early 1970s. A building for the government, uncertain client usage other than government departments will move into a huge complex, and we don't quite know what sort of subdivision, we don't know how many different departments there will be. It has to be an entirely flexible building to cater for anything in the future, given the amount of square feet that they want. And we came up with a scheme, and had to be built quickly, that's made a building that's, and this is a prototype to show that it's made on only 3 elements. So it's facade beam, a cross plank, and a column. And by mass producing those 3 elements, we built a big project. And when it came to building the cores or the access to these office wings, they were made of traditional construction, elevators and stairs and ducts and so on in them. But the rest of it, where those 3 components were used, are all they were all the same. And we built huge movable gantries, because the building was so big it just moved along and put these 3 bits together. There's the planks being assembled, and the facade beam, which obviously expresses, they're all structurally expressive, and they span, what's 15 meters? Over 50 feet or 55 feet, I think, from one side to the other, and the facade beam goes 25 meters, which is almost 80 feet. Now, today, this would be not warranted anymore. See, 20-odd years ago, 25 years ago, there were no cranes that could pick up this thing economically. It weighs 80 tons. Today, I can ring up and order a crane that picks up 100 tons like a feather, and I needn't bother with these gantries. And that's what I'm saying. Technology, and inevitably what happens to architecture, changes. Even in our own time, within 25 years, we got tools and opportunities now that didn't exist before. These elements were, of course, tied together. You know, there's a facade beam, there's this core that carries the surfaces. These are the pre-stressing anchorages, which almost like Gropius, you know, the little medallions are stuck there to hide, to cover the anchorages made of stainless steel. And well, this is the undercroft of the building, but you can see how wide open, obviously, every typical floor is by using this system. I will say something more about the upswept nature of these beams, which is something initiated by Nervi for us. The difference being that in the middle, maximum bending warrants a T-beam. At the end, a T is a bad thing, because it's quite unstable in support to resist shear. Shear at the end is best resisted by taking all this concrete and sweeping it up into a thickened rectangular cross-section, which gives the advantage that within the thickness of the floor you can run mechanical services. Main ducts can run there and distribute between these ribs. And that's a way of overcoming the problem. But most people say you can't have long spans because you know, you've got to hang all the ducts underneath it and the building gets that much higher. It's not true. If you make the structure and mechanical services interact, you can do them both within the same thickness. In 1980, we were asked to be competitors in an invited competition for the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. This was our scheme, which wanted a banking chamber, again, great big open space underneath, and a really expressive, huge span here for the office buildings, even more than you've seen before. And of course, we didn't win, didn't get there. But the director of the bank that had visited each of the 6 or 7 firms, they were in England and in America and Australia, Europe, he came to visit each one of them just to make sure what kind of people are really competing and what do their clients say about their work. And we rolled out the red carpet and treated the guy right and showed him all our best, but we still didn't get there. So soon after the announcement, as you know, Norman Foster was appointed the architect. He rang me up and said, sorry you didn't get that, but I like your things. I'm the president of the Hong Kong Club. How would you like to do that instead? So that's how we got this job. Because it fitted the bill. The club had an old piece of, an old building here standing in the center of Hong Kong. This is the cenotaph at the very center of central Hong Kong Island. They were made the proposition by Hong Kong Land Company developers, we'll build you a new club as long as you let us put office floors on top of you. And he said, well, that sounds like a good proposition. We want the new club, but we don't want to know that there's these office floors on top. We're used to having our main entrance right opposite the cenotaph, and we want a balcony for the governor to take the salute and all that. Let the officers enter from the side. And we don't want any columns coming down in the middle of the club. So this is what actually happened. Here we developed this following on that competition. T-beam, as I say, in the middle. You can see a person there. This is over 2 meters high, sort of 2.5 meters high. And the compression flange reduces toward a rectangle for shear at the end. And this has got, of course, an almost Borromini-esque effect when the sun shines. But it's a clear reflection of what nature wants you to do. There's a plan of the building that shows, because they have enormously high winds there, typhoons, these columns are turned into very rigid, you know, lateral load resisting forms. The core is attached to the back, and this spans up to 17 meters. I don't know what that is. It's quite a long way. And the facade's 35 meters. But inside, the advantage is that you do get total freedom of what to do. They're all pre-stressed floors, but you can see the interactive nature of what the club wanted: halls, restaurants, lounge, and so on. This is the first office floor. And again, following the same principle of having the shear resisted in this upswept T-beam form. We were asked to do the Australian Embassy in Paris in about 1973. The site was very difficult, an odd triangle, very awkward shaped thing that used to be a railway station along the river. Marvelous view in one direction, toward the Palais de Chaillot, right next to the Eiffel Tower, and a park in the foreground. And the planners of Paris said, well, you're in the historic part of Paris and you'll behave yourself in that you have to relate to the axis of the Champ de Mars or its counterpart, and we did. And our scheme was to repeat those axis and it's right angle to it, and between them we struck quadrant shapes. Because we referred to the Palais de Chaillot, which they all like, and it's on an axis and the cross axis, and it has quarter ellipses on both sides. So, you know, you did that before in Paris, so how could you be wrong if you do that? So they bought it. We were warned you'll never get a building through there. The Americans had tried to build an embassy there or add to it, and they don't allow anything. But we managed to get that on that argument that they've done it themselves before, so it must be right. This is the building then. One is an apartment building and one is an office building. The office building turns its back away from the river, and the front is a precast building where Nervi helped us open up a drive-in for the ambassador's Mercedes to be able to go in. But how do you build a quadrant-shaped building with these methods? And this was the beginning of all kinds of building forms of this nature that we built subsequently. You make those T-beams that you saw before, and you make them a bit wider on one side than the other, and you put them together and you get a curve. The result is a great big open floor, which is just what constantly changing organizations really want in the long term. To have obstructions in it would be much worse. So that's 16 meters in that case. And the French were very skillful at making these things in the factory and readily lifting them up by cranes. As I say, they became very, of course these don't weigh as much as the others. There's about 11 tons in that. But when you start wanting 80 tons lifted up, you need today's cranes. And inside, this is even the ambassador salon, these units can just be painted on the underside. If you need services, like all these wall washer lights, they come out of the crack between the units, and the units are quite undisturbed. The air conditioning is under the windows, where you can get up from below, or against the core. So this same principle we extended to high-rise buildings, because there's great economy and speed comes from repeating structural elements that go together quickly like a mechanoset and that gets a building up fast. Here in Sydney, and you can see the change from the earlier picture I showed you, this is taken from the roof of that round building I showed you to start with, but all these towers have come up in the meantime. There's a famous opera house by Lin Utzon. You can see the bridge and marvelous view in a diagonal direction to the main harbor. The city is sort of divided on two sides of water, and also to another area of water in the opposite direction. So that was a given, because I still believe that the view and outlook and expansive outdoors to a building gives it far greater desirability, level of desirability than anything that faces a congested urban street. So on the right is the structural scheme. And, you know, this, to come back to this relation to art, I think there is something that happened simultaneously in the painter's world. This is Frank Stella, who was intrigued with quadrants also. And the quadrant, of course, is a form that relates to the square very readily. And that happened about the same sort of time that this building went on. It's changed and does very different things now, which I'll show you later on. And they also have some effect, I believe, in what architecture does at any one time. Here you can see the identical steel beams. The core goes up in concrete before, and the steel beams all the same. Now what you pay per ton of steel when they're all the same is a fraction of when everything's different. When capricious architects make contorted shapes and order each beam and all its welding and hand-done things separately, you get nowhere, I believe. It takes too long, it's too complex. So I think there's something to be said for maximizing this sort of approach. We have a strong sun, which I mentioned before, and in this case the full-height glass is protected by blades that are all the same, but they're fixed at different angles along the facade. They go from vertical, where the low sun hits the building, to horizontal, where the sun is high. And the main thing is to keep the heat load off that glass facade and save energy. And that is a common sense thing, I think, that anybody would surely do. And again, the building only covers a comparatively small percentage of the site. It has a sunny plaza with fountains and trees, and it has that's where you can eat lunch when it rains. It's got a closed, or rather protected plaza. And here's Stella some years later, and what he's done is canvases have come off the wall, and they aside from the forms that are quite riotous that he uses now, it's become a spatial object as shadows cast within the element. And I think this is a greater richness than I think one has seen before. And I will show you some things that have had an effect on the sort of thing one does within these confines that I discussed in buildings. Here's a plan of that building that shows 15-meter span, again without any columns. The core contains all the elevators and services. Fire stairs are separate. And inside, of course, you can do what you like. You know, you can have walls that do wild things. You can have open landscape offices. You can have boxed up offices, whatever is needed. And that's a constantly changing commodity in our world. Nothing really stays the same. They tell me that when a tenant in an office building can see the water, if there's water nearby, as in this case in Brisbane, he'll pay up to 20% more rent. So when a developer tells you that, they said, give me as many offices as you can facing the water. You analyze that, and you find that the best you can probably do is a building where more than 60%, by shaping it like this, that look up and down the river. So it's a river, it's a limited width here. If you put a facade there, only the bottom people will see the water. The top ones will just look straight across and see land again. But in this way, they look up and down the river. So that's the reason for the shape. And this is again translated into the structural plausibility thing, where every beam's the same, and this, every facade element's identical. It looks round, but it's not. Each one of these elements is straight, the same length, and equipped with appropriate sun shading. Where there's no shade, no sun, you leave it glass, and you start the sunshade where it makes sense. But the waterfront development and the plaza around this building is what gives us its impact. As I say, removal from traffic, fountains, access to food, trees. We transplanted this huge fig tree. There's a big garage underneath, but this is a great pits that are landscape that are watered and so on. You can grow big trees in a concrete environment. Now, the desire expressed again by the client was they want impressive lobbies. I mean, nowadays, I will show you some of the horrors, of course, that people resort to when that is posed to them in this day and age. But I think spaciousness and great big openness, and it's, of course, a semi-tropical climate which needs protection for people to get into the building. When somebody gets out of a taxi and during these heavy rains, they need a canopy. So this is the reason for that glass thing. So we gathered the columns in this expressive form here, which again reflects quite clearly what happens structurally, how through a hyperbolic paraboloid, the stresses generated by these point loads here get taken down into forming the opposite wind directing direction at the base. And yeah, that's the lobby, and you know, this became less rigid, so these ribs brace it against the core, and we've seen something like that before. Let me just say something of one of the last ones of this kind, that with the height limit in the corner of a city, the outlook was paramount. So you get more distance by curving the building around, aside from which there's a railway under this corner. And this is the shape of building. But you would think that that's crazy, you can't do that with this sort of system, but you can analyze it to result in exactly the same expedient routine of having standardized forms that go up just as fast as any of the others. And the building looks like that, which follows the same principle. Now, you don't always get a big site where you can do marvelous things. Here, squeezed in between other buildings, what on earth can you do when somebody says, I want a headquarters office building on this site that's only 100 feet wide and surrounded by buildings on all sides. There's a funny backyard here, which you don't know what to do with. But this is obviously where you can, it's only got one street facade. So it's impossible to cover the whole thing with buildings because nobody could have any windows. So we, by analyzing the program, they had lots of departments which don't need all that much space themselves. We always left 2 of the 6 squares open, but in different locations. Sometimes they're at the bottom, then they step up, and the shelves that are produced there, these terraces, we planted big trees so the people inside get their own outlook because they have no other. There's only a narrow street to look at. And that's the result, so that the sun actually shines right down to the bottom through this by stepping the opening toward the sun. You can see the light coming down there. And of course, by having hollowed out this thing, it becomes all wonky and shaky. So the engineer says, I want shear walls, and he said, you can't have any because I want windows. So you've got to brace the thing to stand up. But you can see how it's glued in up against other buildings on both sides. So we maximized the openness inside, but also by bracing it like that, we got rid of this big column in the middle. So on the bottom, you can just walk into the thing without any columns at all. And that, I think, made a lot of sense there. That's not a very good picture, but that's what you see when you look up. You can see the sky and all these stepped up things. And at the ground floor, it's just like a rainforest with trees planted inside it. So we didn't really almost want to do that job to start with. We thought nobody could turn that into a building, but if you're pressurized enough, you can come up with answers for almost anything. The aspect of view and the relationship of building forms is the last thing I want to talk about. Perth in the Western Australia has got a wonderful Swan River. It's almost like a big lake all along the city. And anybody who builds there would surely want to make everything face that way because it's attractive. And so you adjust the structure just in the way that I mentioned before. You push the core away from the view against the side you don't particularly want to look at, and everybody here has this outlook. And in the same way as I mentioned before, the building, and this is a very windy place. They warn you about no outdoor spaces. You've got to shield them because it's windy. So you put this on the lee side, surrounded by shops, because the street architecture is asked for it to be extended. And it makes sense. It's a shopping street, and but you walk through this into this oasis almost in the middle. And that's where the restaurants and the trees and so on happen, both day and night. A connection to parking garage on the other side of the street. There's a bridge across the street, but in a form that I think you've seen before. Computers do amazing things now in terms of being able to make a working drawings out of just quite a violently shaped thing of this kind, where each piece of glass is flat. There are no curved pieces of glass used. The sun is particularly strong there, and in this case we not only have horizontal but also vertical blades to shield the glass but still not obstruct the view. And the flamboyance of both structure and form, I think, is somehow repeated in this work by Charles Perry, who you may know, who is an American. The last problem is one of relating several such buildings in such a way as to avoid them blocking each other's view. Now, this is only one project, also built on top of an expressway. And, you know, any kind of buildings that you put in this sort of narrow confine, in this case, are shaped so as to minimize the amount of obstruction. They face outward and they face away from each other so as to minimize. It's also on the edge of the Sydney Harbour. So everybody gets a water view and you avoid this. And that the result of that is, here it gives an impression, of course, of the fact that mechanical equipment now gets smaller and smaller. You don't need a whole floor for mechanical gear, so you cut it down and you make a form that's repeated in other aspects of the project. And this is the proposed space that connects all the three buildings. I was talking about Stella and the kind of forms and the flamboyance that has come both in his and in other painters' work. And I think this has had an inevitable effect on architecture, because aided and abetted by the improvements of not only structural potential that exists today, but also constructional devices that help us put what previously were quite impossible things to assemble together now. Here's a Stella painting of a similar time to the one that you saw in that building, in that it comes off the wall. It's become virtually wall sculpture, and the form of the building reflects this kind of flamboyance. Let me lastly talk about what we're now involved in. Oh, this is another picture of a Stella actually on this flamboyant stair. What we're involved in Vienna. Vienna, as was said before, I was born there, I was 15 when I left. It's nice to be called back and do a big project there. Vienna has a remarkable history, and I'm sure you know about it, in its 1920s housing. The city now has a socialist government, which it did have then, which produces remarkable housing then and again now, a great big gap during the Nazi period, of course. This was built in about 1925 or thereabouts, 24, I don't know, 27. Karl Marx Hof, it's in all the textbooks. After the First World War, there was a great push by their then Red Vienna government to produce workers' housing, and I think some of that is of quite remarkable quality. The present government it continues that tradition, and they've called us in to build a huge scheme of this kind. This is Vienna. The old city has where the wall used to go around the medieval city, which has been pushed down and now become the Ringstrasse, which is a great boulevard with all the historic buildings, and there's St. Stephen's in the middle, the cathedral. There's the opera, and Keltnerstrasse, the Graben, wonderful city. From there, in 5 minutes, you take the underground to the river, or the United Nations, which is on that side. Well, along the river is an expressway, as is so usual that people use public land for such things, 8 lanes wide expressway, noisy, unattractive. So the city has decided, due to pressure of people who live there in quite tall buildings, to cover it. It's half a kilometer long, and in that way, or to start not only utilizing the result, which is a newly gained piece of open land, they make out of that land suitable for housing. And here's the expressway, as you see along the water. There's a new recreation island being produced. This is the river's been harnessed now. It used to flood a great deal in my day, and now it's all controlled. It's blocked off there. So this is a kind of swimming area and boating area. So it's a marvelous site. The site is, as I say, along this expressway, and it has this shape. Along the river and this sort of island bit next to it where all the approaches are. Now there's 3 buildings in existence and other housing, some of this going back to the 20s, this is about 1950s. And this is a recreation area. Well, the first sketch I made of that is responding to the politicians saying, well, these people scream blue murder if you block their view. They're used to having a view. So whatever you build there, take that into account. You can see here the 3 buildings, and we left a view corridor so that they do have, obviously, get some of the view obstructed, but they still see something. And we turned the buildings. Originally, they wanted us to just put buildings straight across the beams that inevitably go over this thing. It doesn't make any sense because the buildings that would go straight across would put a lot of load on one side. This, by the way, also harks back to sort of constructivist space paintings. These building forms that are exploded, separated, but floating and orientated in different ways. Now, it makes sense to turn these buildings from a construction point of view, a structure point of view, because they distribute their load over several beams instead of only one. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, I think. So that's the scheme that we're building there. It's about 850 apartments, where every apartment looks at the water. There's an office and, again, apartment tower on the area where we're not on top of the expressway. But here, because we spread the load, they allowed us up to 8 floors down to 5 instead of a maximum of 6. The outlook we analyzed from every apartment virtually, and you can see the kind of view that people will have even if they do see the building on the other side. Yeah, this is the principle I was talking about. Instead of putting all the load on these 5 beams, it's better to turn buildings sideways, and this has got 19 beams that carry it. And you can see how you have to fit the elevator pits in between those deep beams that span the... They got curious building regulations that require Brandabschnitte, meaning sectionalized offices against fire. Quite an old-fashioned notion, but you know, you turn that to advantage and simply cut the sort of buildings that you saw us do before with the same principle into different forms. And the top of this 3-sided building, offices down here and apartments on top. These 2 wings looking at around the base of the tower is the shopping center. It's surrounded by traffic, but shielded completely with high walls. There's a tunnel underneath for pedestrians that come from the underground station. And this, again, one of our secluded, hopefully a place full of nice coffee houses a la Viennese style. And this, no doubt, I believe, also relates to what William de Kooning paints in terms of its forms. Utzon's daughter, Utzon, who designed the Sydney Opera House, his daughter is an artist, and each one of the buildings has an artwork of hers in gold and aluminium, so as to give a distinctive aspect to each of the building. This is what's going on there now. These beams are 10 feet high and 10 feet apart, 3 meters, and they span a long way, and they got enormous cranes with long reach there. So that goes on now, but the whole thing won't be finished till 1997. Now, just before closing, I can't help but say something about what besets, I believe, architecture in the Western world today. In about 1960, this was published everywhere in the world. This is Mr. Moore, Charles Moore in Louisiana. He makes us feel closer to history by showing us, you know, what was Rome and It's a kind of parody on classic architecture. For a while, the world was mesmerized by this because they'd never seen anything like that, and isn't it nice to come back to the old forms? And then you take a look at the back. What is this? The sham of it all is freely expressed here by the rotten wooden formwork, wooden structure, and bits of ticky-tacky plasterboard. The effect that that has had, though, on the world is just indescribable. In my view, people who built remarkable buildings 2,000 years ago knew something about what holds up weight. The Romans built this at the time of Christ. Fabulous structures, daring arches, really carrying loads. And who the hell's kidding whom by putting a big arch here in a 50, 60-story building? That is absurd. And it's as it were a trivialization of history. You know, it's somebody who obviously has no respect for the great things that have been done in the past to make a joke of it. I don't think it's very funny, but this is really sick. When you see this Greek columns made in public housing in Paris, made of glass. And, you know, I think there's an outrage when that building in London carries the name of Skidmore, Inks & Merrill, which was a firm that did some remarkably excellent work in this country in many places. This is done by Skidmore's, and I had to be convinced that, look at it. I mean, have you ever seen anything more kitschy, more absurd, more just plain awful on all counts? It gets worse. Because in London, they kicked out the architect who won the competition for the extension to the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And on comes Venturi and builds this imitation facade to try and imitate that building quite ineptly. Look at this flat top here entrance. The rest of it is a curtain wall box with a stair inside. It's got a great big arch that does nothing. You know, it's just a steel arch that doesn't even reach the side walls. And the worst of all, almost, is Prince Charles. If there's one good reason for Australia to become a republic, it's the thought of this man being our king. Because he tells us the time has come to build a la 18th century, and he's serious about that. Arab associates won a competition around St. Paul's for a revamping of this whole area, but no, he didn't like it, so he says this shall be. And from what I understand, it's serious. It's going to get built. So let me finish up by something from my hometown, which is a building built in 1890 by a group of artists who were sick of tradition in the 19th century way. They wanted to express their own visions, and they wouldn't be hung by the establishment in the museums. So they built their own museum. And the inscription at the top, it's called the Secession, the secessionists, the people who broke away from the way things are normally done there. The Zeit ihre Kunst, the Kunst ihre Freiheit. To each era, its art, and to art its freedom. I think we should remember that emblem. Thank you.